I obviously was very, very excited to preach this gospel. I jumped right in. And I am, because it's a gospel that sets us in such an important direction. But let me start by making kind of a brief announcement. GPS has changed my life. GPS has changed my life for the better. Back in the old days, I used to tell a lot of stories about getting lost. But with GPS, for the most part, although GPS can sometimes make its own mistakes, I don't get as lost as I used to. I can actually get to places. But I still have a few stories because even though I can get to places, cities, if I'm walking around depending on myself to find a particular place, I still get a little lost, even if I use a map on my phone. It's the maps, I think, that confuse me. At any rate, not too long ago, some parishioners from a parish that I used to be stationed in called and wanted to ask me some questions, so suggested that we meet up somewhere for lunch. To a town that I'd been to before, but I wasn't all that familiar with. So I said, sure. We set the date and the time, and they gave me the location, the restaurant that we were going to meet up in. And so, by way of GPS, I got to the town beautifully. I found a parking space immediately, but I then needed to find the restaurant that I was going to meet my parishioners in. And I looked and I looked and I walked around. I couldn't find it on my own. I knew it was somewhere. I couldn't even find the ocean. It was in a seafront part of town. I couldn't find anything. And so I finally wandered into a part of town, and this is a little town north of Boston. I wandered into a part that seemed to be kind of new. There were very large office buildings. And so looked around, couldn't find anyone or anything, but I could tell it was a new part of town because the buildings were kind of really brand new. They were very impressive, different levels with park benches for people to sit on. And it was about noontime, so there were people from the offices outside having their lunch. And so I saw a group of women sitting together, 4 of them. They were actually sitting on the wall outside whatever building they worked in. So I walked up to the 4 of them and I said, "Excuse me, but the 4 of you, you look like you know stuff." One of them immediately countered with, "I know nothing." And she pointed to the sign, the building that they all worked in. It was the district courthouse. "I know nothing," she said. And I kiddingly looked at her and said, "It's safer that way?" She said, "Absolutely. I know nothing. Sometimes it's safer that way." I thought of that story when I prayed these readings last night, getting ready for our time together. Sometimes it's safer to pretend that we don't know. Sometimes it is safer, seemingly, to pretend that we don't know what we are called to because we have a relationship with God through Jesus. That very first reading reminds us of something that's so important, that we are meant to believe there's power in the words, "Whoever sows sparingly will reap sparingly," because those who sow bountifully will reap bountifully. You and I are invited to sow bountifully. We are invited to, at all times, not play it safe. Because sometimes when we pretend that we don't know that Jesus calls us to compassion, forgiveness, how many times? 70 times, 7 times. Sometimes when we allow ourselves to forget and play it safe, we allow ourselves to not be as forgiving as we might be, not as compassionate as we should be. The letter truly reminds us of something that the saint whose remembrance we celebrate this day, St. Lawrence the Deacon, he knew that it was important to spend his entire day sowing the seeds of Jesus, seeds of compassion and love and forgiveness, sowing the seeds that would allow others to realize that Jesus too was calling to them. He never played it safe, and he ended up living a martyr's death. And to this day, deacons throughout the world serve their church, making sure that the poor are tended to, that the needy are noticed. They don't play it safe. They see a job and they're unafraid to make sure the job is done. So how do we do that? Well, the gospel. Today's gospel from St. John reminds us in a very clear way that we are called to, one, not play it safe, to be brave. To be brave enough to allow that part of us that might be afraid to be like Jesus to fall to the earth so that his bounty can rise through us. In a very real way, my friends, we are invited to not play it safe. Unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it falls to the earth, it produces. It continues to nurture the world around us. You and I are invited to be brave enough to not play it safe, to get the self out of the way, to not be concerned with what people might think of me if I'm too compassionate or too forgiving, because the world doesn't always invite us to be that compassionate. The world doesn't always invite us to be that forgiving, and yet Jesus does. What we celebrate this day as we remember St. Lawrence the Deacon is that we are all called to serve. We are called to let go of self-interest so that we can, in not playing it safe, notice around us the people that need to be served, the job that needs to be done, and be unafraid to do it.